Good afternoon. I'm Neil Quilliam. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East North Africa program here at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to host this event today and to invite you to our talk, our panel event on Qatar's foreign policy, balancing new alliances in a contested region. Before I introduce the panel, just a few housekeeping notes. Today we're going to suspend the Chatham House rule, so the meeting will be on the record. We are live streaming. Please do feel free to tweet and using hashtag #CHEvents. We'd be delighted for you to do that, but please do switch off your mobile phones to stop any interventions into the session. We've got a very strong panel this afternoon of 4 speakers. It's unusual for us to have 4 speakers in an hour, but given the gravity, given the importance of the subject, we wanted to squeeze as much into the hour as we possibly can. I'm going to ask them to speak just for 5 or 6 minutes, and I will do my best to keep us on time so that we've got hopefully about 25, 30 minutes for Q&A, which I'm sure there will be lots of that. Anyway, what I'm going to do is just introduce one speaker at a time, and then we will sort of kick off. So to my left, we have Her Excellency Lolwah Al-Khater, who is the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Qatar. Lolwah, if you could give us 5 to 6 minutes, please, and I will try to sort of keep you to that.
Sure, that's very challenging, as you can imagine. Good afternoon, everyone. Very delighted to be here at Chatham House, especially amongst friends and colleagues. I was just explaining to my colleagues here is that given the diversity of the panelists' backgrounds and expertise here, I think what we will be discussing is really also beyond Qatar's foreign policy. And if you allow me to start with that, to kind of portray the context within which Qatar's foreign policy operates. Last week, or actually 10 days ago, I was in a closed session, and the speaker next to me was asked to give a diagnosis to what he thinks are the main reasons beyond the current Middle East crisis or crises. And indeed, he listed a number of things, all very important: violent extremism, immigration, migration, and other topics. And as I was listening to my colleagues speaking, I was thinking, well, are all of these really causes in themselves, or are some of them symptoms of other problems? And if you allow me in the remaining 4 minutes or so to kind of look at what I think is the main root cause of the nested crises that our region is going through. And that I can summarize in one sentence. It is the failure in the nation-state building process. Unfortunately, unlike many European countries, our countries did not necessarily grow, develop organically. In the aftermath of the colonial era, a number of Arab republics were born, as you know, and as we know in political science, the very essence of any nation and nation-state building is really the nature of the social contract, isn't it? So the social contract at the time was mainly premised on the anti-colonial sentiments, right? So these regimes in many Arab republics gained their legitimacy through those anti-colonial sentiments. But this legitimacy started to deteriorate as the socio-economic conditions of living for the peoples of the Arab region started deteriorating. And there had to be an alternative. In my opinion, it could have been one of two. One is to develop into a more representative form of governance. And I'm being very particular here. I'm not saying necessarily democracy. I'm saying more representative form of governance. Or the other option is to have economic development. We see many Asian countries that are not necessarily democratic, but they are providing for their people. These countries failed to do either. They did not develop into representative form of governance, and they did not achieve economic development. And we reached the point of explosion that is the Arab uprisings in 2011. and 11. The best description ever I've heard of the so-called Arab Spring is that it's like an earthquake. You don't ask whether an earthquake should have happened or not, do you? You ask how to deal with it in the aftermath of the earthquake. And unfortunately, the responses to that earthquake by many Arab countries were not very intelligent responses. Some decided to deny that an earthquake happened in our region. Not only that, some of them decided to actually go after those who claim that an earthquake actually happened in our region. And once again, that was not necessarily the right answer. Denying the problems and the accumulative issues we've been having in our region, such as failure in development, poverty, the basic human right to dignity for the Arab peoples, denying that is not going to help us in any way. So the solution, the way forward, and I conclude with that, is to acknowledge that we have problems. We acknowledge that the marginalization that was being consistently and systematically exercised by many Arab regimes, police states, is not the answer. We don't need more marginalization in our region. We need more inclusive policies in our region. We need to recognize the basic rights of the peoples in our region. We need the rule of law. We need checks and balances. This is the way forward.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear exposition. I now call upon Abdullah Baabood, who's a very good friend of Chatham House. You've been engaging with us for many years, and former director of the Gulf Research Center, and also you were based at Qatar University for many years. Abdullah, can you just package your 5 or 6 minutes and maybe give us your key talking points? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. And it's a pleasure to be here again at Chatham House. First of all, I want to echo what Lolwah just said, and that is, the failure of the colonial and the post-colonial Arab state has led us to what we are now. And we're just going around in circles, not being able to actually tackle the problem that is facing the Middle East, not just the Gulf states, but the whole Middle East. And the earthquake that you mentioned, as we know, earthquakes, do come and go, and they come back again. So we'll have to be careful that this, if we continue the way that we are, and we keep failing at all different socio-economic development and political participation, etc., these earthquakes are going to come back to haunt us. So, the whole region is actually threatened. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about. I have to switch what I'm going to be talking about now because of what Lolwah had just mentioned. And I'm going to talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council. As you know, the Gulf Cooperation Council is one of the regional organizations that has been constructed to help the region to achieve peace, security, stability, and development amongst the member states. The Gulf Cooperation Council is a very important regional organization, and it's a rule-based regional organization, as some people here in the UK would know. Regional organizations are of utmost importance to their member states. They help integration, they help cooperation, etc. Especially when you look at the Gulf states themselves and their economic dependency on oil and gas, and their limited, if you like, other resources apart from oil and gas, and their small market, etc. Integration and cooperation between these countries is actually one of the tools for economic development and prosperity. What we have seen now for the last few years is that the Gulf Cooperation Council is dismantling, and it's almost on its deathbed, as it were. So it's not just the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, but also if you look at all other Arab regional organization or attempts at regional integration have all failed. And it's goes back to the idea that, the failed, basically the failed post-colonial state to deal and to know how to develop from there onwards. And it's a real pity because if you look at the whole region around the Middle East, you see it's all in turmoil. Libya, Iraq, Syria, etc. The list goes on. And the last part or piece of the Middle East that was still in some peace and prosperity, etc., was the Gulf states. And the last thing you want to see is this turmoil actually comes to the Gulf states. We need the Gulf states to be working together. We need them to be coordinating their policies together and developing not only for the benefits of their own citizens, but also for the wider region and for the larger global prosperity. And what we have seen is now, because of this crisis that has taken place between members of the Gulf states, this is no longer the case. The GCC is no longer functioning as a regional organization. The GCC Supreme Council, which is like the higher decision maker within the GCC, is not being consulted because of this crisis and was never even given a role to mediate in the crisis. The crises were taken outside the GCC mechanisms when it actually relates to the GCC functioning. It relates, for example, for some of the agreements that has taken place. And one of those agreements is the GCC Common Market, which calls for free flow of goods, capital, and people. And of course, this crisis, as you know, has stopped all of these free movements between the member states. So here is a decision taken by some countries, part of the GCC, affecting one of the most important agreements that's signed between the member states and taken outside the GCC mechanism. Basically, effectively brought the whole GCC to a standstill. And not only that, this crisis, other countries that were not involved in the crisis see that it is not just, maybe it started with Qatar, but it's not going to end up with Qatar. There is some kind of an idea that perhaps there is going to be a redrawing of regional maps and redrawing of regional structure. That there are some people who want to meddle with the existing structure and change things as they are. And therefore, the crisis itself is much more dangerous, and not only for the countries involved, but the whole region. The continuation of this crisis, it doesn't really help anybody. And the quicker it's ended is the better for all the people in the region, but also outside the region. Don't know how am I doing with time.
I think you've got about 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Well, with that, I would say we'll leave it for Q&A. But thank you, Nir.
Thank you very much. You've both been very good timekeepers, and you've sort of set out context, and you really left us hanging there, Abdullah, redrawing the regional map. I'm sure that the audience are going to want to sort of unpick that and sort of see what that means. So thank you for sort of leaving it hanging there. Next, we've got Courtney Freer, who is a research officer at the Middle East Center at LSE. Courtney, I think you're going to talk a bit about Muslim Brotherhood, and I hope you're going to sort of mention your book in that process.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here, and also to talk about the role I think the ideology has played or has been perceived to play, especially in the GCC rift, and especially when it comes to Qatar. I think that oftentimes Qatari foreign policy has been inaccurately viewed through the prism of ideology. There's this idea that Qatari foreign policy supports Islamists anywhere and for whatever reason, and this is, of course, patently untrue. And I think what's interesting is to look at how domestic experiences in the Gulf states with Brotherhood movements inform their foreign policy decisions abroad. And so I'm just going to speak briefly about the role of the Brotherhood in Qatar and how that's kind of informed decision-making or stances towards Islamism more generally. So there's actually no brotherhood in Qatar at present. The brotherhood chose to dissolve itself in 1999. It started much like other brotherhood movements throughout the Gulf. In the mid-1950s in particular, there were lots of members of the Egyptian Brotherhood coming to the Gulf to staff understaffed and nascent educational and judicial sectors. So this happened throughout the Gulf, and actually brotherhood members and the movement itself was welcomed by these leaderships, even in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because this was a bulwark against Arab nationalism, which was, of course, the #1 enemy of the day. So you have, of course, brotherhood movement coming in from the 1950s, and then through the 1970s, you have the establishment of the brotherhood branches in Qatar and in the UAE. They were founded earlier in Kuwait and Bahrain and elsewhere. In the Qatari case, the Brotherhood never actually formed a political arm. It was mainly socially active and in terms of promoting dawah and tarbiyah and things of this nature, rather than forming kind of a political arm and asserting any kind of political stance. So really, its role has differed, I think, from when we look at brotherhood movements elsewhere in the Gulf, where they did become politically active. We see this with the Sahwa movement in the 1990s in Saudi Arabia in particular. We see Islah in the UAE taking on more and more kind of oppositional stances in terms of wanting more equal distribution of wealth across the different emirates. So in the Qatari case, it was fundamentally different. And I think this has informed how the Qatari government has thought about Islamism and about it not being fundamentally dangerous or fundamentally threatening. And I think that often actually the influence of the Brotherhood and of Islamism in Qatar in general it's uninstitutionalized and it's often personalistic. So you look at someone like Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who of course has been in Qatar, who arrived, I believe, in 1961 from Egypt, has been in Qatar since that time and has had a very public platform in the past in the country. And I think, of course, his role as a Sharia scholar and as an influential personality in general in the Muslim world affected his position in Qatar. But also he did have a personal relationship with the former emir, with Sheikh Khalifa, who, interestingly enough, from what I've read, seemed much more politically attuned with kind of Arab nationalism than with any type of Islamism. So it's interesting to see how that personal relationship played out. I think also in Qatar, so we see the experience with the Brotherhood at home influencing the stance in terms of not being afraid of the Brotherhood, not seeing them as fundamentally threatening. But I think we also see pragmatism. We see this desire to distinguish itself from, in particular, Saudi Arabia, which has vehemently opposed the Brotherhood, especially in recent years. I think, for instance, hosting the office of Hamas, hosting the office of the Taliban, as well as hosting online platforms like Islam Web or Islam Online, give Qatar a platform that its neighbors don't have. And I think this granting a platform is often misconstrued as support, when in fact having these platforms actually makes Qatar part of the conversation, part of a global kind of Muslim conversation that I think the other Gulf states don't have that kind of positioning. So I'll stop there and leave the rest for kind of Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gosh, that's great. So next, finally, I call upon Helen Lackner, who's a research associate at the London Middle East Institute at SOAS, to give us 5 minutes, and you're going to touch on Yemen and a few other issues.
Yes, I think I will talk partly about the country where the earthquake is ongoing and extremely long-term, and indeed possibly raises questions of geology because it shows no sign of ending. And I was basically going to say a few things about the history of the relationship between Qatar and Yemen. And the main activities were about 10 years ago, really, when Qatar, in its period of being very active in mediation, attempted to mediate between Saleh and the Houthis, and indeed almost succeeded in doing so. And many question why it failed in the end. And one of the main answers about that failure in 2008 was that Saleh did not want any investment taking place up in the Houthi area, which was one of the parts of the agreements that had been achieved. But I think in retrospect, it's also worth wondering to what extent that agreement was sabotaged by the big neighbors next door, who also didn't really want to see anybody else interfering in their relationship with Yemen. And so I think that largely explains, those two factors explain the failure of that set of negotiations. I think the other second aspect of the relationship prior to the war was that Qatar in Yemen, as in other places, invested in some real estate, and particularly in one project which I personally think was somewhat misguided, but in any case, it's getting nowhere fast, so it doesn't really matter. And the third aspect relates, I think, a bit to what Courtney was saying, was the support for the Islah Party, where again it's worth remembering that the Islah Party in Yemen is not a traditional Muslim Brother party, but is this conglomerate between Islamists of a somewhat Muslim Brother connection and northern tribesmen. So I think that prevents some of the past situation. I think in a sense the Qatar problem with the UAE and Saudi Arabia it has actually been a serious bonus with respect to Yemen for Qatar, because it's managed, Qatar is no longer involved in this war, which is increasingly unpopular and increasingly, gets increasing criticism from everywhere in the world. And therefore, it no longer bears any responsibility for this and can easily detach itself from it. And at the same time, it's taken some very good measures in terms of supporting basically United Nations humanitarian activities. And that is something that is very accepted by all, and certainly, appreciated by what now appears to be close to 14 million people who are dying of starvation. The second thing I wanted to talk about, which is not about Yemen, is about Qatar's relationship with developing countries in general. And there's basically two aspects to that. One is, of course, the major aspect of the labor migration, with over 2 million foreigners working in Qatar. And I think this has been possibly, might have happened otherwise, I'm not in a position to know. But it happened, thanks to the blockade, that the agreement was made with the International Labour Organization, which is fundamentally transforming the conditions and the labor conditions of the workers in Qatar, and vastly improving it and bringing them up to, pretty close to excellent working conditions. And I gather that it's not fully implemented yet, but I would personally say that implementing this not only will have a major impact on the workers and their families, and just if we're talking about the case of Nepal, we're talking about 6 million people out of 30 million. So it's a very significant number of people who are, 6 million is not the number of workers, it's the workers plus their families and all the rest of them. And their remittances at the moment are 2.2 billion per year, which is, a very significant amount in terms of the country's national budget. And this is just one example. There are many others, but I took that one because in terms of population percentage, it's the most important. And it seems to me that not only is this important for these people and for possible development and economic development and social development in these people's countries, but it's also a model which the rest of the GCC will eventually be forced to apply. Not that they are particularly willing to do so, I don't think. So it's a very fundamental transformation in the relationship between migrant workers and their host countries, as well as the impact this can have on their home countries. And I think that's all I will say, so we can have more time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I really hope during the sort of Q&A session that we can perhaps probe a little bit about Qatar's relations with Turkey and Iran and what that might mean for MISA. I hope we can also talk about its relations with its other Gulf Arab state neighbors. But I won't take the prerogative of the chair because I want to use this 30 minutes as best as we can and make sure that the audience can ask those questions. So I will now sort of turn to the Q&A session. What I want to do is I'll take 2 questions at a time. We have roaming mics. So if you could, when the mic arrives at you, if you could stand up, give your name and your affiliation. And having been at Chatham House for 5 years now, I know that some of you will be very naughty and try to sneak in 2 or 3 questions, and I will stop you immediately. So 1 question per person, please. No follow-ups. And if you have a statement, you can keep it to 20 seconds, but then no question. Yes, please. Let's see hands for questions. This gentleman here, please. Thank you.
Hi, Joel Gulhani from the Risk Advisory Group. I'm a Middle East analyst there. I wanted to ask, leading on from what Dr. Quilliam just said, about the new alliances that Qatar is engaged in, the changing alliances, given the events over the last couple of years, and how that has affected Qatar's ability as a foreign policy actor in the world.
Thank you very much. And we'll take a second question. Yes, please. Thank you.
Michelle Neubert from NBC News. I'd like to ask you about the current state of relations between Qatar and Saudi, particularly in the event of the recent events in Turkey.
Thank you very much. Right. Who's going to take which question? Would you like to take first or second question, Lolwah?
Sure. I mean, well, hard to pick, but I'll go with the first one. When it comes to the alliances, you know, the term alliance has a very particular meaning, especially militarily speaking, politically speaking. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that something changed dramatically. We still have our ties and relations, militarily speaking, with the US and with other countries, including the UK, France, and other countries. Politically speaking, likewise, I would say. What has changed, I think, dramatically is really the economic relations. I wouldn't call them alliances, very difficult to classify them as such. And in this case, I would say that Qatar has diversified its dependencies when it comes to that. As you know, 90% of our food and medicine used to come through our neighbors. No longer is the case. And even if things are restored, I think there is a strategic decision not to go back to the old supply chains. Now there is an outlook more towards Asia when it comes to that. At the end of the day, Asia is importing most of our LNG, most of our revenue as Qatar comes from Asia. So I think there is an extra effort to strengthen these relations.
Qatar, Saudi, do you want to take that?
So you're cheating because
That's my prerogative.
No, absolutely. I don't think anything has changed dramatically, Michelle, is it? Yeah, I don't think anything has changed dramatically, to be honest. What we see, maybe we're just hoping that there is a wake-up call for everyone, and of course, our condolences go to the the family and the friends of the journalist.
Thank you very much. Anybody else on the panel want to come back on any of those points? No?
Nicely covered.
Okay, great. Next questions, please. This gentleman here with the very nice kafia. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ali Ali. I'm a Bahraini activist. Just a few points to Lolwah. You talked about the... All right, so basically, I remember that the Qatar... All right, so I remember in 2011 when Qatar sent troops to Bahrain as a part of the Peninsula Shield, and then in Yemen as well, when they were part of the war on Yemen. Now, I heard Lolwah saying that the earthquake that happened hasn't been dealt with very well from all of the GCC's country, and I hardly can find how Qatar have dealt with that. Now, the situation that I look at, Qatar is still doing that as far as the media that's supported by Qatar. For example, Al Jazeera News, they are still supporting the far-right oppositions in London, the far-right Bahraini opposition in London, and that is making it hard for the situation in Bahrain to deteriorate. Now, the question that I'm asking Lolwah, is this going to be continue after that crisis finished, or is there any strategy from your side to help to stabilize the situation in our countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take another question. Yes, please. And whilst it's great to ask all questions, we do have 3 other fantastic panelists here, and I don't want them to feel neglected and to tell me off afterwards.
Forgive me, because I'm going to disobey you on that. James Landale, BBC. I just wondered if I could push the spokeswoman again on the Saudi issue. What action do you believe that the United Kingdom and other European countries should take in response to what has happened?
Okay, sorry about that.
I guess I have to handle both questions in this case. So to Ali's question, I would kind of revisit just some of the statements that were made, especially that you kind of asked a number of questions in really one sentence. In terms of the participation in the alliance in Yemen, it is very clear that Qatari troops never entered Yemeni soil. I mean, it was part of this sense of solidarity, which was unfortunately completely neglected as part of the GCC crisis. And I guess now Qatar has more incentive to pursue its own independent foreign policy, regardless of what the neighbors think about this independent foreign policy. So the very example you actually brought up gives us the reasons why we should pursue our own independent foreign policy. To the question about the kind of reaction we would like to see, there was a statement, a joint statement, which the UK, France, Germany, I believe, issued. And I think this statement, for the time being, summarizes all the actions that everyone wants to see. We would like to see a transparent investigation. We have faith in the legal system in Turkey, and I guess everyone is anxiously waiting to hear what is going to be announced tomorrow.
Thank you. Abdullah, you teased us. You talked about redrawing the regional map. You talked about restructuring the region. What did you mean by that? Can you just maybe unpack that a little bit for us?
I was hoping, Neil, that you wouldn't ask me and press me on that. But as you know, we have the countries in the region are new, in terms of their independence, etc. And when the British withdrew, there were a lot of issues, regarding borders, etc. And this goes back to what has been said earlier. The whole issue about the nation state and what it is and where are the borders is still not resolved. There are lots of historical antagonism between the Gulf states, since we are talking just here about the Gulf, but it goes beyond that to the whole region. There are dynastic competition between them. The borders are still disputed, and this crisis basically showed that it is, that these problems are still there to haunt us. They have not gone. They haven't settled down their differences. They haven't gone beyond the fact that we accept each other as we are and let's move on and develop some kind of relationship that is cooperative for the whole region. What we are seeing is that, they're going back to the old style of deceit and conflicts and even borders. You've heard about what the issue about the canal, that they want to cut off Qatar from the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, which is, to my mind, is a big joke. But also, you've seen that some of the maps that were drawn on the region where Qatar was actually taken off the map. And even parts of Oman was taken off the map. And these are not necessarily isolated, innocent incidents. There are lots of things that are going on that still haven't, come up. But it shows that this crisis is much more about domination of the region, about the countries, stopping them having independent foreign policy, maybe redrawing the maps, restructuring the whole region. It's also this is part of the counter-revolution, if you like, of the anti-Arab Spring. They don't want another earthquake in the region, and they're following these policies, thinking that they're going to put it down. But in fact, this is going to even create more tremors in the region if they continue with these policies, because the whole region is being fragmented, and the cost to it is not just a Qatar, Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini, Egyptian issue. It's much more than that. It's the whole region that is suffering from it, but also the security of the region, and also the alliance. The allies of the region are also facing issues of how to deal with this region. Whether it is in business, but it's economics, but also military issues. They're talking about confronting Iran, for example. How can you confront Iran if your whole region is this fragmented? You're talking about this Middle East NATO issue. Again, what is this about? We've heard so many different proposals in the past. I'm sure some of you are old enough to remember the Damascus Declaration, the enlargement of the GCC to bring Jordan and Morocco into it, the deepening of the GCC to have a GCC union, and now we have a NATO-like alliances between odd bedfellows. They're not even talking to each other. So how could you have an alliance between people who are not working with each other and they don't trust each other? So, we are going through a very, very difficult period, and the implications of which is not just for the region. I think it goes beyond it because of the strategic location of this and importance of this region.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. I'm glad I asked the question. We have a question just here on the end, and then the lady next to it, please. We'll take those two questions together.
Hello, Rinald Mansour with the Middle East North Africa program. My question as well to Abdullah. You mentioned, these are two half questions, so it's not two questions, it's two half questions. You mentioned that the GCC united is better for regional stability. I wonder when the GCC was united and when the GCC unity actually meant regional stability. Can you kind of unpack how a united GCC could actually lead to regional stability?
Thank you. And if you could just pass it along to the lady next to you there. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really a follow-up question to the one that was just asked. And I'm Samira Qawar from Argus Media. And whoever would like to pick it up is welcome. We're still talking about the GCC as though it still existed. Does it exist, or is it completely fractured? And is it fractured beyond repair? We've just heard that Qatar is going to pursue its own independent economic policies and supply chains, and that politically it's also going to pursue its own foreign policy. Whereas before, the GCC seemed to be going, at least in some aspect, towards a union, customs union, currency union, what have you. Is that all dead now, for good? Thank you.
Thank you. Abdullah, do you want to sort of spearhead the answer? Then we can ask colleagues to flow in.
Want to do that? Well, we can blame the GCC for a lot of things, and there are a lot of shortfalls that the GCC can be blamed for, and the list goes on. I mean, I can talk about how the GCC has not functioned in many ways, but you could say the same thing about any regional organization. Regional integration takes a long time. It's not easy. And you've seen it here in Europe. And, it just not took a long time, but there are countries that want to come out of it, as you know, with Brexit. So just to say a few things about what the GCC has achieved in terms of regional stability and security, is first of all, it has created this free market, this space for all of us. We can travel together. We can travel to each country with our, ID cards. We can invest. We can work. I'm Mani, worked in Qatar. I didn't have to have a visa. I didn't have to have any special permission. I can just go there and work with my ID card, as it were, and treated as a citizen in the GCC countries. The GCC, again, in short, created some kind of a forum where they can talk into international organizations. They entered into a lot of trade negotiations with the EU, with China, with US, strategic dialogue. All of this has helped the GCC kind of to work together and create a semblance of regional security and stability. And there is, of course, the Peninsula Shield. There is a lot of other security. There are a lot of other issues that actually don't hit the limelight and don't hit the news that the GCC is working on in terms of harmonizing policies, etc. So yes, it has helped, and there were a lot of confidence within this regional organization that it is going to succeed. But just to follow on that, does it still exist? No, I don't think it exists now. It is really in its deathbed, and I don't think it will ever come back in the same way that it was before. Because I think there are a lot of mistrusts, and how could you? GCC is a regional organization. A regional organization are based on rules, and if you don't respect those rules, and you don't follow them and act outside those rules, you lose confidence, and people have lost confidence, not only in Qatar, which is being subjected to this blockade, but also in other countries, and also amongst the business people. How can they trust a GCC that can suddenly erupt like this and come up with, with the policy that changes everything that they have signed and everything they have agreed upon? So, and also we've lost credibility and trust with our international partners, like the EU. For example, the EU and the GCC were having a group-to-group dialogue. No longer is the case. The EU is now talking to each country individually, like if the GCC doesn't exist. So it is a very serious issue, and I don't think this has been taken into consideration when this crisis erupted. They did not know what implications it's going to have on the whole region.
Thank you.
Just a quick anecdote on this, picking up from where Abdullah actually finished. Let's take the European Union. I mean, does every country in the European Union have, to an extent, its foreign policy, its own foreign policy? Yes. Is there this degree of independence? Yes. But then collectively speaking, are there certain committees and institutions that are working together? Yes. So despite all the challenges that the Europeans are going through, almost the vast majority believes that a world with the EU is better than one without the EU. And likewise, in our region, we still believe Qatar has been subjected to this illegal blockade, yet we still believe that a region with the GCC is better than a region without the GCC. Yet, having said that, I think that the very charter of this GCC needs to be revisited, and the institutions need to be reconstructed again.
Thank you very much. We have a question down here. Thank you. Just wait for the microphone. I see another hand.
Thank you, Neil. Dmitry Zdanikov, I'm from Reuters News. I have a follow-up question for Ms. Lolwah from the Foreign Ministry. When you spoke, you said that the development of the past 2 weeks and the killing of Khashoggi should serve as a wake-up call. Could you elaborate a little bit? Who should be walking up to the call, and what exactly people should realize as a result of this development? Are you referring specifically to Mohammed bin Salman policies and the Western attitude towards them, or it's just a broader statement? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman down in the middle here with his hand. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Joseph Garboni, Chatham House. You talked about redrawing the maps, and you mentioned Qatar, and you mentioned perhaps Oman. I wonder, with the current situation we're talking about, and with the fears within the royals, the Saudi royal family, is there any talk about maps for that part of the world, as in Saudi Arabia?
Maybe not take that question. You want to take this other question? I don't know.
I'm just thinking about my colleagues as well, like
sure.
The rest
Yeah.
of the...
No, we are. Yeah. Please, yes. Maps would be great.
Well, very quickly, there is what appears to be at least a step towards redrawing maps in the eastern region of Yemen, with Al-Mahra Governorate, where There have recently been serious clashes between the locals and some Saudi forces. The Emirati forces have been turfed out. And, there are apparently beginnings of the building of a pipeline that would go to the Indian Ocean. So this could be regarded as a potential step towards a map redrawing. Though I think many of us would hope that it's not the case. But, if you talk about dismemberment of Yemen, that's one option. You could then, if you look at history, you can then have the north with Asir and Jizan. I mean, one can go into a number of fantasies which are, I think, largely undesirable, so I won't continue.
In terms of, I guess, the effect of Jamal Khashoggi's death, I think what's interesting is looking at some of the early reactions out of Saudi Twitter and press was that this was a Qatari-Turkish conspiracy to disappear Jamal initially. And the fact that story was circulated throughout the internet initially, it just shows the extent to which this rift does still exist and is still very much in evidence and not likely to change too much. And the fact that that's happening kind of with GCC member states accusing the others of, I guess, I don't know what they were trying to suggest had happened to Jamal, but the fact that was even bandied about, I think, shows the extent of the rift and the extent to which it's not likely to be settled anytime soon. But as far as what should happen and reactions, I'll leave that to my colleagues.
Do you want me to answer that difficult question? Be brave and do that. I think, if I understood it correctly, Saudi Arabia is a very important country to the whole region and to the Middle East, but also beyond that. The stability and security and prosperity of Saudi Arabia is important for everybody. And it is basically the core of the whole GCC. And also, given its role in the Arab and the Islamic world, it's very important that, we all wish the best to Saudi Arabia. And we hope that it continues the way it is in terms of being the locomotive of the GCC, pushing the integration forward. But at the same time, we don't see that happening, because of the crisis, because of some of the new policies that has come up. And it's regrettable to see that, because no one really wants to see any problems or any issues that are going to affect Saudi Arabia. So we do hope that it will continue and stay as one solid state that can bring the whole region together in a much cooperative way and bring the whole GCC together. But I think there needs to be some kind of a change in terms of how it deals with the smaller Gulf states and gives room to everybody to function. But I will end up with and have independent foreign policy within a certain framework, because each country has its own different strategic calculations. But I will end up also, if I may, on this with what happened to Jamal, and it's a wake-up call. It is a wake-up call. As a member of the GCC, as someone who comes from the region, and sometimes speak my mind a little bit more than other people, we are scared of what is going on. If this is going to happen to someone who doesn't really oppose the government, just a simple journalist that can be critical sometimes about his own government and some of its policies, if it could happen to someone like that, it could happen to any of us. And this is not just one isolated case. There are a lot of people who have been locked up in some of the other GCC states as well. So the political space has really been closing down on people to talk and speak their mind and be independent, whether it's academics, whether they're researchers, or whether they're media people, or whatever. So I think this is a wake-up call for all of us to say, well, enough is enough. We need the region to go back to where it was, where there at least there was some space for people to air their views and their ideas without having to fear for their lives.
Thank you for saying that, Abdullah. And I think that's a very, very important point, and I think that took courage to say that, and certainly on a live stream as well. So really appreciate you making that point. Thank you very much. Courtney, I have a question for you. In my conversations with officials from Saudi Arabia and from the Emirates, I've often sort of probed away talking about Qatar's foreign policy, and they've always argued quite consistently that we're not against Qatar having an independent foreign policy, as we're not, and they point to Kuwait, and they point to Oman as having an independent foreign policy, but they then caveat that by saying, but the groups that they support, because of the ideology, operate in the inimical interests directly against Saudi and Qatari interests in the region and in the countries. How do you square that with your sort of non-ideological foreign policy?
Well, I think really if you look at groups that Qatar has supported, they're not all of one ideological stream. So that's kind of one way of looking at it. And I think looking at domestic experiences with the Brotherhood, as I do in my book, Rentier Islamism, which I had forgotten to plug earlier. But in any case, I mean, I think if you look at the experiences in these countries, it does inform their opinions of how dangerous they are in the region. In Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for instance, Brotherhood movements were linked to movements for political reform, and so I think that makes them believe that they are fundamentally destabilizing elements necessarily in other parts of the world. And so I think that they think that Qatari support, or at least openness to engaging with Islamists, will lead to kind of destabilization more broadly. And I think also that there is this fear of kind of transnationalism, that the Brotherhood is this transnational organization and wants to destroy the nation state and create a caliphate. And of course, the early Brotherhood tracts do use the word caliphate, which is unfortunate for us today. But I mean, this is not a policy point. This is not a goal of Brotherhood movements locally today, and hasn't been for, I guess, ever really. But I think there is this fear of transnationalism and fear that that they could have power across borders, and that supporting them from abroad kind of foments that transnational network. And I think that transnational network doesn't really exist. It exists in terms of kind of personal ties, more so than any kind of structural organization.
Okay, thank you.
May I comment on that? Because we often hear these arguments, and I would like to kind of challenge this argument and deconstruct it by giving examples. I won't defend Qatar's position. I would like to test the validity of these arguments. Do we all recall when, the Crown Prince of Saudi met Al-Islah Party a few months ago? Al-Islah Party, just like mentioned by Helen, is supposedly an affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood. How does this work with this narrative of them being so worried about any Muslim Brotherhood affiliate groups? How does this work with their narrative and rhetoric about Islamism? They support their own groups of Islamism as well. So I would like to challenge that very argument.
Okay, thank you very much.
If you look back in history, the Saudis were sponsoring, all these Egyptian teachers you were talking about in Qatar, certainly in Yemen, thousands of them, were all selected as being brothers and such like, and they were financed by the Saudi kingdom. And we're talking about the 80s and 90s.
Until very recently.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. I will take two more questions, and then I'll ask the panel to sort of address parts of that, or maybe just give us like a 30-second wrap-up, because we've just got a few more minutes left. There's a hand right over at the back there. I can just see gentleman without the tie. Thank you.
Hi, Mohammed Habib from ABCO. Question to Lolwah. You mentioned that you're looking to the East for relationships now, building stronger relationships. What about other Arab countries that are not part of the GCC? Has any relationships improved there, and do you find that they have to choose either between you or Saudi?
Thank you, and then this gentleman down here. Thank you. Sorry, can you just wait for the microphone? Thank you very much. And introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ghassan Ibrahim, journalist. Your Excellency, you mentioned that Qatar never sent soldiers to Yemen, but Qatar news agency several times mentioned several soldiers, Qatari soldiers died in Yemen.
No, this is inaccurate. Qatari soldiers never entered Yemeni soil. They've been at the borders of Saudi and Yemen, and this is 100%
Now the question is, does Qatar have strategic policy or is just tactical? Once you were with the Saudi against the Houthi, now you are giving them big platform. In Syria, you used to support, or you support Muslim Brotherhood and Nusra, another type of Islamist as well, to fight the Iranian militias. Now you are the best friend with Yemen. Do you have really a strategic policy in the region? Thank you.
So these, once again, many questions in one question. So let me kind of spell it out and unpack it for everyone. I think you made many statements that I would completely disagree with. The role that Qatar played in many countries, such as with the Houthis, was a mediating role. So I think this is to be actually appreciated rather than condemned. When it comes to the relations between Qatar and Iran, I mean, once again, the relations between Qatar and Iran, believe me, they're not very different from the relations between Qatar and any of the GCC countries. Just to give you an example, any relations between any two countries. So, I mean, let's speak mythologically now beyond perceptions and cliches. It's either military relations, it's either politically, and it's either economic relations. Militarily, there's zero, nothing. Politically, well, we restored the diplomatic relations, which we did cut off for the sake of Saudi that blockaded us. And it was actually Iran that gave us access. Now, the third point, this is the most important point. Please focus on it, the economic relations. The only passage Qatar has as a result of this blockade is through Iran. So it's a relationship out of necessity. The question is, how does this relationship compare to our neighbors, United Arab Emirates? 90% of the trade between Iran and the GCC is dominated by United Arab Emirates. According to Iranian statistics, UAE used to be, until last year, the second partner, economically speaking, to Iran after China. And today, it is the third partner. So, if anything, I think this question needs to be directed to our neighbors rather than directed to us. There was a question.
There was another question.
There was another question.
Yes.
Sorry, I cannot recall the question, sorry.
About relationships with other countries.
No, absolutely. I mean, the relationship between Qatar and many other Arab countries, especially when it comes to food security, for example, are developing. Beyond unfortunately, the three or the four blockading countries, I think our relations are just excellent, and they're developing with Jordan, for example, even though Jordan, reduced, as you know, the diplomatic ties during its crisis. Qatar actually, announced aid to Jordan. 10,000 Jordanians are going to come to Qatar for jobs. As a matter of fact, despite the blockade, 200,000 Egyptians are currently living in Qatar, still working. They're our brothers. We're having, I think, beyond excellent relations with many Arab countries.
Thank you, Lolwah. 30 seconds each. Do you have, what are your sort of concluding points, Helen?
Well, I think the main concluding points I would like to say is I don't want anybody to think that I was in favor of the blockade when I was saying that it had some positive side effects. I think I regret, unfortunately, that I have to agree with Abdullah about the current state of the GCC, because I think for Yemenis in particular, they were looking forward to the days when the GCC would allow them to come and work there. Thanks. I think that's enough for my 30 seconds.
Yeah, I guess I would just stress again that the extent to which ideology is overplayed as a driving point for a lot of foreign policy. If we look back just as recently as 2015, I believe it was the Saudi foreign minister said, we have no problem with the Muslim Brotherhood. And today, of course, things have shifted quite drastically, and there's this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood is this terrible terrorist group and is for some reason linked to Qatar. And so I think that this is more about power. It's about the withdrawing the map, things of that nature, more so than about ideology.
Abdullah, one thing you did say, you mentioned like maybe an afterquake or another earthquake coming. I don't know whether you want to touch on that or you have something specific you want to say, but that was a very sort of poignant intervention you made.
Well, the circumstances that created the Arab Spring in the first place have not gone. The fundamental reasons for it are still there. You know, corruption, mismanagement of resources, autocratic, authoritarian regimes, etc. And the development model hasn't worked. So, you know, sooner or later, this is going to come back to haunt us. People are going to ask for jobs and asking for opportunities, and young people are increasing in the Middle East. So you cannot keep everything under the lid. It's going to come back to haunt us. But what I want to say also is that the region has had enough. It's enough than its own share of crisis. The leaders in these countries in the region, but also the global partners, need to stop meddling in the region and help the region to get together to work to overcome this crisis. We live in a neighborhood that is, you know, quite hard and quite difficult, and this kind of competition, hegemonic competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia over there is not going to work. Neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia is going to be able to have a total hegemony of the regions. All the Gulf states, smaller Gulf states, will try and find ways to work and balance out each other. Now, the best thing is for the whole region is to think beyond conflicts and confrontation and to learn a few things from other regions in the world, particularly here in Europe, and to see how can we move forward. How can we bring Yemen into some kind of a regional integration project? How can we bring other countries? But also think the unthinkable, and how can we engage with Iran? Iran is a neighboring country, and we are not doomed to have conflict with Iran. We have issues with Iran, yes. We have issues in some policies with Iran, yeah. But I think the region has to think beyond that for the future of humanity.
Thank you very much, Abdullah.
It's just left to say that there is a need to have a new kind of security pact, understanding. I mean, we don't even agree on our very threat perception, as the blockading countries themselves don't agree on that. We really need to start a regional dialogue to kind of set our priorities, our threat perceptions, and accordingly come up with some sort of a security pact that would work for all. We don't necessarily need to agree on every single issue, but let us agree on the priorities.
Thank you very much. I mean, I would love to take that further and ask what role internationals might play and what role the US might play, but I want to congratulate you and the audience. We haven't mentioned President Trump once in that whole hour, and I think that's the first meeting I've ever chaired like that. If you could join me in thanking our panelists, thank you very much.